Okay, Q&A.
Rabbi.
Yeah.
All right, it's nice to meet you. I'm Jack. I don't usually come to this class because I usually have a Ruset this time with Rabbi Lubo. But one thing that's been on my mind a lot is and I actually tuned into your video on Torah Anytime about this Shmoneh Esrei and kind of understanding what you're saying. And one thing that bothers me is when I'm davening, most of the time, what I'm saying, I don't understand what I'm saying. And it's kind of, it would be nice to know what I'm saying. What's the best way, and I know it's going to be a long process, what's really a good way to, I guess, learn Shmoneh Esrei, at least the basics?
So this is what I recommend. And different people need different styles, so I can't say this will work for everybody. But I recommend saying the Shmoneh Esrei in English, so you do know what you're saying, and start by writing. You can write in the siddur, write over the Hebrew words what the English words are, and then let's take a line and say that line in Hebrew, looking at the English words, and then read the rest in English, and go line by line. And in a couple of months, you'll be saying the whole thing in Hebrew, and you'll be understanding the whole thing.
Thank you.
Especially since certain words repeat over and over again. Baruch is there a lot of times, so you get used to Baruch once, you got you have 20 words already on your list. I think that's what you should be doing. You should be understanding what you're saying, and you do satisfy the mitzvah of davening if you say it in English. You do. So I recommend doing it that way.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Yeah.
I was told by Rabbi Kaplan that you are allowed to accept conflicting midrash, but you're not allowed to accept. The midrash. Two different midrashim are allowed to conflict, but two different Gemara have to be reconciled. I'm saying they are the way
He couldn't have said that. He couldn't have said that.
How do I say it? I think I'm misquoting.
Yeah.
In the Gemara, you always have to reconcile an argument, right? If there's two different opinions, you have to find a way to reconcile or agree to disagree. Is that correct?
Agree or disagree? That's fine. They might agree and they might disagree.
No.
Let's lay out the possibilities and take care of them one by one, okay? There are disagreements in the Talmud. It's called machlekes. Okay. There are lots of disagreements, and there remain disagreements. People take different positions on different subjects. Both in the Mishnah this happens, and in the Talmud this happens. When a discussion in a particular page comes to a conclusion, but doesn't say the magic word hilchasa, let me explain this. Hilchasa means the law is, and it means that the rabbinic authorities of the Talmud decided that this should be the law. That's usually binding. No later generation can challenge that. If you would have a discussion in a page of Talmud which came to a conclusion and said the word hilchasa, and in another page of the Talmud, just discussing the same subject, would come to a conclusion and say the word hilchasa, and the conclusions would be contradictory, that would be a problem. But if the word hilchasa doesn't appear, it means no body of authorities made a decision what the right law is. There was just a discussion. A discussion came to a certain conclusion, and then elsewhere it came. That's what's called machlokes sugyos. This, after all, what is the material out of which the pages of Talmud are made? Basically, it's discussions between the scholars at a particular time, often with their names mentioned, and different discussions can come to different conclusions. So that's not something that disturbs us. And the same thing can be said about redundancy. Suppose you have the same question asked in 3 different places and get the same answer 3 times. Sometimes even on the same page. In other words, there'll be a challenge to a position from a Mishnah, and you'll get an answer reconciling. And then you'll have a challenge from another Mishnah, which says essentially the same thing, against the position, and you'll have the same answer again. You can have that 3 times. And the critical reader thinks, why did you have to tell me 3 times? Isn't it they told the reader 3 times? It's that in one yeshiva they discussed it and came to this conclusion, and another yeshiva they discussed it also and came to the conclusion, and the third yeshiva they discussed it and came to that conclusion. And the reason for reporting all 3 is to say 3 different bodies agreed on it, and therefore it has considerable strength. Whereas if it only happened once, it would have less strength. So these are reports of discussions that took place over a 300-year period, or more, in a 50-year period. And of course, there will be redundancies like that. There's nothing wrong with that. And there'll be differences of opinion. And often, the description, the commentators is machlokes hasugiyos. It's a difference agreement between this discussion on this page and that discussion on that page. And that certainly is possible. That doesn't have to be reconciled.
Okay, so I guess I'll go back and clarify with him what he meant about Gemara. I must have misunderstood. But is it true that two midrashim can conflict?
Sure, because if they have different authors, if it's the same author in the midrash, then you have to work on it. He may have changed his mind. That happens also. But if different authors, yes, of course. Just like in the Mishnah, you can have differences of opinion. Beis Hillel, Beis Shamai were famous for having dozens of differences of opinion. They're both recorded in the Mishnah.
I thought that midrash was like oral Torah that we're not allowed to contest the account of.
Just a moment. Let's now think through what you're saying. Think what you're saying. You said, is A correct? Well, I thought B was correct. But A and B really aren't the same thing at all. There's a difference between saying there's an internal disagreement within the Mishnah on the one hand, and saying on the other hand that I can contradict it and refute it and discard it. Those aren't the same proposition at all. One is internal to the text itself, and the other is attacking the text from the outside, from a later generation. Those two are not the same thing at all.
Wait a second, just taking the midrash, I'm a little bit confused on the purpose of midrash. So yes, they can conflict, but is it not oral Torah, the midrash?
That's the Mishnah.
Well, the midrash is also oral Torah, but in this case, it's the oral Torah recording the differences of opinion of those two scholars in the midrash. Maybe this is part of the problem. Maybe you're associating oral Torah with what Moses communicated orally and didn't write down in the Torah. It goes all the way back to Moses. That's a bit of a mistake. Oral Torah means the sum total of material that wasn't included in the written text of the Tanakh, right? But that includes King David's laws that he invented and Ezra's laws that he invented, which were much, much later additions. It also includes the opinions of later scholars about how to understand what Moses told us, both oral and written. So all of that is called Torah Shebaal Peh. It's not the oral Torah. It's not that the whole of the oral Torah goes back to Moses. So that's why you can have difference of opinion. Yeah.
Before the pairs of rabbis like Hillel and Shamai, did the rabbis still disagree on stuff, or was it just generally one consensus and no argument?
No, they did disagree, and we even have on record that Saul and King David disagreed about a particular law that determined their different opinion about the way David's marrying Saul's daughter. Difference of opinion is part of the natural condition of the Jewish people. Indeed, the Maral explains, the Sanhedrin had on it how many judges? 71. Rabbi Yehuda says 70, but the Chachamim says 71. That's a lot, isn't it? I don't think you have a judicial body like that anywhere in the world, 71 members. And the idea is, people are various, their grasp of things is different, their life experience is different, their cast of mind is different, and you want to have a really wide representation of possible points of view so that they can all be brought into the discussion. And then the law is you follow the majority vote. That means the assumption is with 71 people, you're not going to have a unanimous vote. You're going to have a difference of opinion. They will disagree. That's a machlokes. They will disagree. And then the law is set by the majority. The Sanhedrin's functioning goes back to Moses. So there's no question that it's expected that there are going to be different points of view. Yeah.
So I hope everyone understands my question. So the Ra says in his Sefer that the Kuzari principle only applies to experiences that would be expected to cause an immediate permanent change in the behavior of the people.
Well, the word permanent is a little tricky, but okay. I say in a footnote there specifically that there's nothing in the definition that prohibits it being forgotten. It does not say that it will last forever.
Yeah, it says here, it is, I mean, speaking about miracles, but it's true by all
Mhm.
traditions. It's limited to national revelation and other miracles that would be expected to cause an immediate, permanent change in the behavior of the people.
Well, if I wrote permanent, if you look at the footnote there, you'll see that it says that does not prevent it from being forgotten. Nowhere does the definition say that it can't be forgotten. So, and the application of it is, when you know the tradition came into existence, it has to be at a time when you would have expected the memory of the event to have been preserved. So that if the event took place in a certain year, and you know the tradition describing it was in place 300 years later, and you say, well, that kind of event, would it have been remembered over 300 years or forgotten over 300 years? And you say, a cataclysmic event like that would be remembered for 300 years. You know something about the memories of the nations and the cultures of the area and the time. Then you say the precautionary principle applies to it. But if the story is, we know the tradition that describing the event only from 1,000 years after the date of the event, according to the story, what the date of the event was, and I know that the historical records for such an event would not have preserved the memory up until that time, then the causality principle won't apply. So it's not a question of expecting every event to which it applies will be permanent. It's that it's got to last long enough so that when I know the tradition existed, the gap between that and the date of the supposed event is such that it would have been remembered by that time.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
So, but it would have, why would it have been preserved during that time? It seems from here that you're saying because it would have changed the behavior of the people that experience it.
Yeah, there would be social memory.
Yes.
Could be that there'll be written accounts, depends upon whether the culture has written records and keeps written records, but that's also a social change. Mm-hmm. I mean, it just doesn't have to be written. Mm-hmm. It can be just a change in the culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so in light of this idea, then I have a question. So the way that I understood the progression of events that make up the revelation of the Torah is as follows. It seems that the entire Jewish people heard God's voice and they understood for themselves the first two pronouncements, I think according to the Rambam or in Nevuchim. And then after hearing this original voice, the Jewish people told Hashem, we can't hear anymore, so please share with Moshe Rabbeinu anything else you want to share with us, and he can relay it over to us. So then Moshe Rabbeinu went up to Har Sinai, ultimately twice, and eventually he came down and shared with the Jewish people the rest of the commandments, which were all contained in the original voice. I think that's how
No, the revelation of the 10 was given to them on the spot, and one explanation works like this: they heard a sound, and what you say about the first two isn't quite correct either. That I actually have in the book. They understood in a certain sense the first two, and afterwards Moses himself told them the other 8, so that they got right away from Moses. And after they had the whole 10 and the whole experience was over, then they said, Moses, we don't want to do this again. We survived this one, but we don't think we'll survive it again. You'll be the in-between, and all the rest of the information of the Torah came to them from Moses. That's correct.
Okay, so the 2 they heard directly from Hashem, and the 8 they heard from Moshe at the time.
That's right.
And then the rest, Moshe went up and then heard from Hashem and came down and shared with the people.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. Okay, fine. So, so that being said, so it seems like there's some machlokas as to whether later when Moshe Rabbeinu came down and shared what he had learned from Hashem with the Jewish people, whether they were able to then hear it back in the original voice.
That's right.
Rashi
Rashi says in the Chizkuni, he explains it that way, that they heard a single compound voice which had all of the information in it and they couldn't understand it. It's a little bit like when you are among people speaking a foreign language and then you learn the language. I started out knowing no Hebrew and no Yiddish, and I used to sing the folk songs. When I learned the languages, I realized I punctuated the words wrong. I didn't separate the words correctly. I just thought it was just sounds to me. I had no clue what it meant. But then, once I learned the language, I could hear in the same sounds the words that were being said, because now I know the language. So it was something like that. They heard this sound, or for example, if you're not used to classical music, and you hear a group playing, and somebody asks how many instruments they're playing, you won't have a clue. It could be 3 or 16, as far as you know, because you can't pick out the different instruments and see and hear what they are. Someone who's used to classical music can pick out every one of them and tell you exactly how many there are, which ones they are. So your ability to experience and understand the sound depends upon how much you know about what you're supposed to be hearing. So when they've been told the content, then they could say, aha, so these sounds were that word, these sounds were that word, and the words were put together in this way, and then they could hear it afterwards.
So it seems like they were able to do it with the whole Torah once Moshe Rabbeinu shared it all.
Oh no, this is just the 10 pronouncements at Sinai. After that, they had no experience of them. They got a yes answer to their request. The request was, we don't want to hear God speaking anymore, and they never heard God speak again.
Oh, that's only with regards to those 8.
That's right.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry. There was just this leading up to a question. All this whole.
Okay, but there are other people here, so.
Okay, I guess I can ask later then.
Okay. Yeah.
So we were talking about yesterday which prayers you should daven, an avil should daven, and I'm wondering.
Which prayers? I'm sorry, I'm not getting it.
Which prayers an avil?
An avil, right? Yeah.
Should daven now. This past year, somebody mentioned to me on the Shobbas before the Yarzeit, you're supposed to daven. You daven the whole davening, the whole Shobbas davening.
Yeah, there are different customs, but you do on Shabbos. That is a custom. I don't think that has anything to do with. I don't know what it does exactly. You're not in mourning anymore.
Yeah.
You're not in mourning anymore. So the Yarzeit is a time when the soul has a special effect and it's under sort of a kind of an accounting, and you can also contribute to that as well. But that's much less formalized than the other halakha. But anyway, yeah, there is such a thing. Some people just daven musaf, some people daven all the tefillos. There are various different customs. I'm not getting the question.
It was like, what's the idea behind doing it
Oh.
on that Shabbos?
I don't know. I don't know where that comes from. Sorry. Yeah.
How do we go about finding a personal Rebbe or Rav, I don't know what to call it, and if we're not going to stay here in Israel, is it best to wait till we get back to wherever we're going?
This is a very good question, and it's kind of tricky. And of course, all questions like this, I'm giving you one way to handle it. You should ask other people. You'll find other ways to handle it. It's good to have some kind of advisor. Some of you know my analogy here is sports. If you're going to do sports, you're going to do training, physical training, you should have somebody who's supervising what you're doing, because at the very least it'll be more efficient that way, more directed that way, and it could save you from mistakes. Not only that, but as my Rabbi pointed out to me, now going back 60 years, he said this is the age of specialization. Maybe once upon a time, and maybe in some cases today, you can have one person who's your guide and your inspiration for everything. But often it's not like that. One person will you go to get intellectual understanding of difficult texts and problems that you're working with. Another person, you watch him do a mitzvah and you're tremendously inspired by the way he does a mitzvah. Another person who can give you advice how to develop spiritually, and it won't be always the same person. It should be a person to whom you have access. Yes, as your circumstance or your environment change, you will change the people who you will have available for this purpose, and that's well understood. So now, how you find such a person? Well, the first thing you do is look for other people like yourself and see who they're getting their advice or inspiration from. And that if this person is helping them and they're similar to you, that's one reason why you would want to be attracted to such a person. I suggest that when you have a person whom you have, as, so to speak, as a candidate, start with things that are small, things that are not crucial and not earth-shaking decisions and so on, but small questions, clarifications, advice, and see what you get. See if you understand what the person says, if you feel understood by the person himself, if he gives you a suggestion how to deal with the situation and it works, that counts in favor. If it doesn't work, that counts against it. see if you feel comfortable talking to the person, and whether the person presents himself in a way that you can relate to. And then as that happens, you then grow into more difficult or more fundamental or more sensitive and difficult issues, and see how it goes. You're trying to get help in developing spiritually. That's what you're trying to do. Someone once objected to me, are you the best judge of who your advisor should be? Maybe not, but it's very difficult to imagine that someone else will be available who'll do a better job. You'd have to have somebody else who knows you very well and says, no, this is not the right person for you, but then that person would have been a candidate to start with. So usually you do it on this kind of trial and error basis, where you start with more smaller issues and smaller decisions, and see and build a relationship that way. That's what I would recommend. You might even find, depending upon what you know about the people who are around, someone whose background might be dissimilar to yours. But that's not always a criterion. My Rebbe, for example, was not a Baal Tshuva, and he became one of the beginners and one of the leaders of the Baal Tshuva movement. So he had the ability to relate to people like us without having ever gone through anything like we went through. So the idea that the advisor has to have the same background and experience as the person he's advising, it's not very smart. Let's take, for example, doctors who treat addiction. Must they have been addicts? Don't think so. And if they treat people who are down and out and living in the ghettos, the fact that he has a Harvard MD means he's disqualified because he didn't grow up like they did, and I don't think so. So I think the idea that they have to be similar in background and similar experience is a narrow-minded idea. Maybe it would help for some people to be that way, but it's certainly not a criterion that has to be followed.
In the meantime,
So in the meantime, there are people here, the various teachers that you have in various subjects, and I think anybody would be prepared, if you wanted to ask a question, a private question or a question of advice, people here would be happy to share their time with you. But that means there's a commitment. And by the way, when you go to ask a question, there's a kind of formula that you could use. There's a difference between asking for a legal decision on the one hand and asking for advice on the other hand. And the person you're asking will know very well the difference that you mean. Advice means you're not committing yourself to take it. A legal decision is much more serious. And then if you get it, the legal decision, it's tricky what you can do with it afterwards. There are ways to work with it, but it's very tricky. It's not something that you can take lightly. But that's why the right thing to do, if that's what your intention is, to say, I'm looking for help or advice about this situation. And then it's up to you to see whether you can follow it or not. Yeah.
Does the Torah have any thoughts on technological process, the technological progress of mankind, or in an ideal world, or is it better that we just all focus on Torah all day and just learning?
Gee, I'm not hearing the relevance of the two to one another. Let's say the Torah had thoughts on it, packed away in the Zohar, which wouldn't be available to you, and then the thoughts are there, and you should spend your time on Torah anyway, other parts of Torah, and it's not either or. They're not...
Like as an engineer, is there a point to building things to help other people, or should I just be focused on spirituality?
Oh, what you should do? Well, first of all...
What one should,
Okay, but now, I'm you probably know me by now, to me the words are very important, and if they aren't crafted carefully. So now you say, should I build technology or should I focus on spirituality? Our view is that you'd better be focusing on spirituality when you build the technology. It's not either or. The physical world is not devoid of spirituality. It's not a subject other than spirituality. Spirituality is 24/7, 365. Everything you do is an expression of your spirituality, including building technology. So there's no time off from spirituality. The question is how you should apply the spirituality in your particular activities. People who work in, I know people who are working in medical technology. They're inventing medical technology. Well, there are people who aren't suited to be studying all day, and they look for something and say, I'm doing something to help mankind. In particular, I'm doing it hopefully in the framework of the Jewish community where I can consider their particular, for example, like fertility, which is a much bigger problem for our community than others because in the Western world anyway, the others aren't committed to fertility. They don't care about it so much. They're not looking to have 6, 8, 10, 12 children. You know, if they have 1.7 children, a parakeet and a dog, they're satisfied. And therefore, fertility isn't as important to them, and it's very important to us. So there's a person who's working in technology, and he's doing it with the Jewish people in mind, and with the mitzvos that can be done with it in mind. So it's not either or. We look upon technology and scientific discovery. I should tell you that many things that are described as scientific discovery are just false. That's a footnote. But we look upon this as a gift from the Creator. It's a certain kind of wisdom, and it gives us certain control over means and goals, control, and that's given to us just like your muscles are given to you, and just like your energy is given to you, and just like your mind is given to you. They're means with which to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And He put them in the world, and He wants them to be used. Assuming that they can be used well, and the downside doesn't outweigh the upside, then He wants them to be used for those purposes. So there's certainly would be no prohibition. Shmuel, the great sage of the Talmud, was a doctor. So was Maimonides a doctor. So was Nachmanides a doctor. They took the time to learn these things because a lot of laws of Torah depend upon physical conditions of people, and they also used it to help people. So the question then becomes, in practical terms, well, where are you in your education? How old are you? What are your options for continuing Jewish education? And if, for example, you want to break into Talmud, that requires full time. It's very, very difficult to break into Talmud doing it an hour or two a day. It's just too hard. It needs thought and repetition, and it's got to sink in. It's an extremely difficult discipline. After you've gotten your feet on the ground in Talmud, then it's a question of doing more and picking up more information. And a lot of information is in English. That could be done while you're working at a job or something else. So I would say education has two goals, at least. One is absorbing information. The other is creating new educational abilities, educational capabilities. And the latter lasts you for your whole life. And the former is a lifetime project. Picking up information is a lifetime project. So there should be a time where you can focus on developing the educational capabilities. And after that, using them and gathering information is a lifetime project. That's roughly. Yeah.
I heard that there's a certain way to wash, basically, when you're taking a shower, like right arm first, left hand, left arm. I don't know if it's a holistic thing or...
I haven't heard of it, but there are these ideas. Maybe you have heard on what you do with your shoes.
I think it coincides with that, but it's also the way that you wash yourself, the right side first and the left side.
Okay. So it's preference is always given to the right, because right and left carry certain spiritual concepts. And I'm choosing my words carefully. They carry them. That means the concepts are present in them. It's not just that we use them as symbols. When you write Table on a piece of paper, there's nothing there that you can put your glass on. It's just ink on paper, which is a word for that. There's no table in the word table. But when we talk about right and left, vis-a-vis these concepts, they're not just symbols of those concepts. The concepts actually are present in those things. So right is loving kindness, and left is strict judgment. And although they are both characteristics of the way in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu relates to the world, they're not equal. Loving kindness is the source of the whole of the creation. Olam Chesed Yiboneh, the world is built out of loving kindness. Everything that's in the entirety of existence has to serve or express loving kindness. So when you have strict justice as a characteristic that Baruch Hu uses dealing with the world, that strict justice has to express loving kindness. Otherwise, it wouldn't be there. You wouldn't be using it. The entire creation is the expression of loving kindness. So therefore, since right carries loving kindness and left carries strict justice, the left has to be subservient to the right. And there are various different ways of expressing that. One is serving the right first. When you wash your right hand first, then you wash your left hand. I'll just tell you what Rashi says in last week's Parsha. I don't think, maybe I never read it before, but it was really something which moved me tremendously. It says, Yamincha Hashem ne'adari b'koach, your right hand is great in strength, strong in strength. Yamincha te'atz oyev, your right hand chases away the enemy. So Rashi says, in this verse, what you're hearing is that God has two right hands, because they aren't the same hand. What was the left hand becomes a right hand. When the Jewish people serves God in the right way, the left hand becomes a right hand, meaning they both function with loving kindness. So that's why it repeats it. The word your right hand repeats because there are two hands. Only one is the original right, and the other is the transformed right, transformed into being a right. That's the way Rashi says it in the verse. And then he says, to me it appears, Rashi very rarely does this, to me it appears it's only one hand. And it's one hand doing two functions, two contradictory functions. Something which he says a human being can't experience and can't really understand. The very same hand, the strength, he says, is saving the Jewish people, and the other thing that's being done is to destroy the enemy. And one is loving kindness for us, and the other is destroying the enemy. And he says, I'll tell you, it appears to me, Rashi says that it's one hand doing the two things which are contradictory simultaneously, something that's beyond our ability to explain. So that's just an example of the fact that it's not the right is not just a symbol of it, it's actually an expression of it. Now with your feet, with your shoes, you probably know you put your right shoe on first, then your left shoe, and you take them off in the opposite order. Why is that? How come putting them on, you give preference to the right, and taking off, you give preference to the left? Is that what's going on? Why would that be? The answer is that's not what's going on. What's going on is this. It's a good thing that you have a shoe on your foot. When you say the blessing in the morning, God has provided me with all my needs, that was said when you put on shoes. You know very well there are whole cultures in the world that don't have shoes. They go barefoot. So I think shoes were like the last thing. In your personal kit, you can do without shoes. You can manage without shoes. The last thing in your personal kit was shoes. That meant you had everything. So you use your shoes in the following way. The time that your right foot has a shoe on it is strictly greater than the time that your left foot has it on. Because you put the right shoe on first, you take it off last, which means that the time that the left foot is shod, has a shoe on it, is strictly less than the right. Now you're giving preference to the right by doing both of them. You're giving preference to the right foot over the left foot. But it's always that way to show that loving kindness is preferred over strict justice. When the priests walked around the temple, walked around the altar, there was a platform at which they walked around. They always walked around counterclockwise because they were facing the altar. The right hand is leading, and the left hand is following. When you walk counterclockwise, that's the rule across the board, that you give reference to the right, because that's where loving kindness lives. Yeah.
So a follow-up to what I was asking earlier. So in light of what we're saying, it seems like the revelation of the Torah took place in stages. There was the experience at Sinai itself, Then there is Moshe Rabbeinu being selected to share the rest of the Torah with the Jewish people. Then there is Moshe Rabbeinu going up and down to hear the Torah and finally sharing everything that he learned with the Jewish people.
Right.
So since there's these different stages, to me it would seem like each of these stages is like its own tradition, right? In which case it would seem like the Kuzari principle would have to apply to each of these traditions separately, and that would seem to be problematic because each one of these stages on its own would not have created a lasting effect on the people that experience it, right? It's a sum total of all these experiences.
It doesn't get off the ground.
Okay, so what am I missing?
You're missing the definition of the Kuzari principle is something that applies to a national experience. The only national experience of revealing the Torah was the revelation at Sinai. Moses came down and told us what he heard. He heard it from God directly. That was personal. It was individual as could be. Only one person heard it. The Kuzari principle doesn't apply to that. It could apply to Moses teaching it to us. That everybody experienced because everybody heard it from Moses. So it couldn't apply to the God's revealing it to him. That wasn't the national experience.
So then what? So how are we using the Kuzari principle to prove that the whole Torah came from Hashem?
We
We
aren't.
didn't hear the whole Torah directly.
We
from
aren't.
Hashem,
We aren't. I never say that in the book. I said that Sinai is a real event rather than a mythical story. The revelation at Sinai. I didn't say the whole Torah comes from Hashem is subject to the
So how do you
Kuzari
take
principle.
that next step then?
With ancillary reasoning. Nowhere did I say or imply that the Kuzari principle is to conclude the totality of the Jewish tradition can all be based on the Kuzari principle. Absolutely not.
So you need to use other reasoning to explain what
Yeah.
the rest of how we know the
Yeah.
rest of the Torah?
Somebody said to me, how do you know Moses didn't lie? I said, how stupid are you? You put him in as your representative, and later you're going to say, how do I know he wasn't lying? You wouldn't do that with your lawyer. But of course, it only applies to national experiences. Yeah.
Oh, but his question about right hand leading. What if you're left-handed?
Oh, so that, first of all, there's a gigantic literature on that because left-handedness isn't a single phenomenon. There are, first of all, the people who use both hands equally, and then how the activities divide up between right and left varies a lot. And there's a big literature on that because some mitzvahs you're supposed to do with your right hand. So the vocabulary that's used, and here I'm at the limits of my knowledge, I'm not exactly how, but this is his right hand. Just happens to be on this hand, this side of his body, because it's the right hand functioning. Now, how much of that? But for example, tefillin, you put on opposite, right? And lulav, when you shake a lulav, you do it opposite. So, I don't know, but whether that makes it into the right metaphysically or doesn't, I really don't know. But there is a giant literature on that subject because people vary in the activities that they do. Some people can write with both hands, but can only throw with one hand. So each case has to be analyzed separately. Yeah.
On the significance of naming children, I've heard both opinions that it's the name in the Chumash that carries more weight, and I've also heard the opinion that it's more about which relative are you naming them after in terms of whatever the spiritual significance you're trying to give. My question that I can't understand, I know that almost every Chumash character has a trial and a tribulation, maybe they failed the test, there's no perfect character in the Chumash, but for example, Dina is a very popular name. Now, Dina is most known for rape, which people debate whether or not it's her fault or not her own fault. And so why would somebody? It feels like you're cursing your child to name them Dina or Miriam.
Okay, this is a very good question. It's a very good question. The idea of naming for ancestors doesn't go back to Moses. Doesn't go back to times of King David. You find it among the Tanoim, 2,000 years ago, where you had generations where they named for ancestors. But it doesn't go back. You have almost no repeats in the entire Tanakh. You have hundreds and hundreds of people. There are almost no repeats of names. But let me give you an insight now. You've raised a question which I think is extremely important. When Sarah dies, it says she was 100 years and 20 years and 7 years. The years of Sarah's life. So the oral tradition preserves an idea for each of the 100, the 20, the 7, and then it says the years of her life, all the years of her life, kulam shavim latova, which literally means they were equal for good. So you read that and think, equal for good, really? Didn't she go through rough times? Wasn't there a time she got angry at Abraham and said, my maidservant became disrespectful to me, and it's your fault. God should judge between us. And the oral tradition calls her out for that and says a terrible thing to say, and she was punished for that. What do you mean they were all equal for good? Okay, it's a good question. At this point, you think to yourself, do I understand the words that I'm saying? It doesn't say they're all equally good. It says they're all equally for good. What's the word for doing there? If the idea was they're all equally good, then you should say they're all equally good. Don't say for. Leave it out. In Hebrew, it's just one letter. Kulam shavim letova. And the answer to that question, because Nochem ish Gamzu, who said Gamzu letova, this too is for good, and Rabbi Kiva, his student, said everything God does is for good. A lot of fours in there. And it seems like quite consistent that the for is in there. And the answer is, there's a lot behind it, but the basic answer is, not everything is good, but everything is for good. Everything leads to good. Everything will bring to good. So the question about Sarah is not, were all of her days equally pleasant, satisfactory, inspiring, joyful? The question is, what was the status of each day for good? So the Talmud says, if you see someone who did something wrong, let's say a scholar, did something wrong, don't have any critique of him the next day, because in the interim he definitely did tshuva. So the question is, what did she do after she said those bitter words to Abraham? Did she rethink it? Did she reevaluate? Did she come to regret what she had done? Did she learn about her own character and take on herself some method of making sure that it doesn't happen again? If so, then that was for good. It wasn't good, but it was for good. So if someone would say, name his daughter Sarah, and say, what about this terrible incident? So listen, people are human. Abraham was human. Moses was human. King David was human. Sarah was human. And she had an outburst, which wasn't appropriate, and she definitely learned from it, and she did tshuva from it, and she became greater from it. So that's something you could wish on your child. When the child will have failures, the child will have outbursts or do things that are inappropriate, that the child will learn from them and grow from them. That would be a very great bracha to give to your child. And Dinah was not discarded by the Jewish tradition. She wasn't, cast away. It's not like Havdil Esav, who was cast out of the Jewish people altogether, even with two Jewish parents, or Ishmael, who was not part of the Jewish people because he had one parent of our people rather than Hagar. That doesn't mean that you're cursing the person. Things will happen to people, and things which need correction and improvement. If they get correction and improvement, then they are sewed together into a very wonderful life. I think that's very important to take into account. Yeah.
So you said yesterday about how our mitzvahs and Torah learning adds to the good spirits, sort of say, or adds to the spiritual world. And I've heard the idea that sitting adds to the spiritual downfall a little bit.
Sitting at the
Sinning.
Oh, sinning, yeah.
And it adds to the spiritual, bad spirits.
Oh, when we're talking about when the Jewish people is connected, and when people have influence, that's right. That's correct. Yeah.
So how does that work exactly when you're?
How does it work exactly? I can't give you rules, precise rules but it's like you are familiar with the fact that the environment that you perceive has an effect on you. There's also part of the environment that you don't perceive that has an effect on you. Not always did people realize, for example, that secondary smoke can hurt a person. He's smoking a cigarette. Dope. Too bad, he's killing himself. Me? I'm just sitting here. Well, I'm just sitting here, but so is he sitting here. And he's breathing his smoke into the air. Yeah, okay. But then studies come out, you also are affected by secondary smoke. Gee, I didn't know that. Pollution, which some people will tell you is affecting everybody all the time, and you're not aware of it. So I know a person who has air filters on his house. Very sophisticated air filters to make sure that all these particles in the air that come from industry and all the rest don't come into his house, so he'll breathe pure air. The rest of us are totally unconscious of it. So just like you recognize that there are things in the physical world which are affecting you and you're not aware of them, people think that these big towers of metallic structures which either are used for satellites and there's electromagnetic radiation going on there all the time could affect the people in the area. Maybe it's true, maybe it's false. I don't know. There's a lot of confusing misinformation out there about these things. So we are aware of the fact that there are things in the world that are affecting us, and we should try to be aware of them. Here you're being told that what the general community affects the circumstances of the people in it. I'll just make one more remark, then I'll go to another question. There is an idea in law. I know it's mentioned in American law, probably in other societies as well. There's no such thing as a private crime. You don't legislate private behavior. Legislation should deal with the way in which your behavior affects other people. But if it's totally private, so then legislation shouldn't be applied to that. Okay, now you have imagined, let's say it's coming to the end of the First Temple period, and poor Ruvain has been sucked into the cult, and he has his own private Baal statue in his garden, locked with a roof, opaque, no one can see in. And when he goes into the garden to worship his Baal statue, it's totally private. Would the rule that we don't legislate private behavior excuse him in some way, or make it problematic to understand why the Torah would say, even if it's locked away in your own garden, you mustn't do it? And the answer is, well, it isn't really private, because divine providence decides what shall happen to the community, in part by summing up the performance of the community. And by his privately worshiping that idol in his garden, he's adding demerits to the calculation and thereby dragging down what's going to happen to the whole city. So it isn't private. It has effects on everybody else in the city. So there's no such thing as something which is really private in that sense, since divine providence takes into account the way in which it'll be treated by summing up everybody's contribution. So then automatically what one person does has an effect on somebody else. Even if airways don't carry it and electromagnetic waves don't carry it, because of the sum totaling of the divine providence. So there's no question that when a person does something, he has an effect on the surroundings around him. And it's true. When he does a mitzvah, he raises things, and when he does it, a very pulls them down. No question. Last question. Yeah.
Follow up on that, though.
Yeah.
Are we not judged on our own actions?
We are judged on our own actions, but what happens to us in this world isn't a result just of being judged on our own actions. That's an extremely important point. The new book, Yeshivat Hashem, is coming out. I have a section on that. And you don't want it to happen that way. Imagine divine providence making a decision for me. Should it take into account my wife? Should it take into account my children? What happens to me? What the consequences will be for them? Shouldn't it? Should it be blind? Should it not take that into account? How could it not? If a human being were making a decision that way, he'd be totally irresponsible. When you lock up a criminal and then his children starve to death, well, that's certainly a reason for not locking him up, finding some other way to deal with him instead of locking him up. The children didn't do anything wrong. Why should they starve to death? So it isn't true that only what you do is determining what happens to you in this world. When you get to the next world, that's a world of real reward and punishment. There, it's only your own record that counts. But this world, you're connected to other people. The example that I always use is Jeremiah lived through the destruction of the first temple. Did he deserve that? Did he deserve to live through the destruction of the temple? Not on the basis of his own record, he didn't. He didn't fail and contribute to the destruction, but the sum total was required the destruction, and he was alive at that time, so he was carried along by that. I think, if I remember correctly, one standard explanation is that when they came to Sinai to receive the Torah, they were immortal. Death was banished. And then when they did the sin of the golden calf, so then it came back and they became mortal again. They had to die. So why did Moses have to die? He didn't participate in the sin of the golden calf. No. All the women lived throughout the generation. No women died in the wilderness. Only the men. Right? What about Miriam? Why did she die? So because Moses' whole essence was to be an embodiment of the Jewish people. The Jewish people are now in that condition. He's pulled along with them, even though it's not a question of his own personal performance that caused it to happen. So that your circumstances, your environment, your relationships to other people, all of them in part determine what happens to you. So it's not just a question of your own judgment. The questions are very good. What can I say? The questions are very good.